This is Juan Garcia. Juan is an agricultural laborer living in Puerto Rico during the early 1900s. His story is told by anthropologist Meryl Singer. Juan works hard to provide for himself and his family, but the work he does isn't intrinsically meaningful to him. As a result, Juan drinks. He uses alcohol as a reward after a long day, but also as a low-cost stress reliever that allows him to cope with the hard, unfulfilling work he must endure day after day. As the 20th century drew on, Puerto Rico began to shift toward a more capitalistic system, creating a surplus of agricultural laborers in the country. This shift left Juan and 55,000 others like him unemployed. So, Juan moved his family to America, where there was an increasing demand for workers. The work didn't pay well, but it was enough to scrape by. His respite drinking worsened while in the States, though. Some suggest that it may have been related to the disproportionate amount of businesses that sell alcohol in poor inner-city neighborhoods like the one Juan lived in. The only thing we can be sure of is that his already prevalent drinking habit was made exponentially worse when he lost his job in the United States. In 1971, Juan died of alcohol-related causes. There are a number of underlying factors that played into Juan's alcohol abuse, the most visible of which is poverty, which he struggled with his entire life. Juan's tragic story of poverty and alcoholism raises an interesting question. To what extent does poverty inform substance abuse? In employing an anthropological perspective, we are able to analyze socio-political factors such as poverty, but also the biological factors that play a role in informing substance abuse and addiction. Let's start with biology. It has been theorized that drug abuse is inherently driven by reward. Research indicates that the brain, and specifically the mesolimbic dopamine circuit, provides pleasure in the process of rewarding certain behavior. In this instance, that behavior is using drugs. Volkow and Fowler suggest that the disruption of reward circuits, too, has the potential to influence compulsive behaviors such as drug addiction. They argued that this process is directly related to the dysfunction of the orbitofrontal cortex. This relationship between brain function and drug abuse demonstrates how addiction is a biologically regulated condition, much the same as any other illness. In fact, drug addiction is considered by many to be a complex brain disease. It even occupies the areas of the brain commonly disrupted by mental illnesses such as depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia. The research suggests that addiction is rooted in biology is vast. That isn't to say that social factors such as poverty don't play a role in influencing drug abuse, though. Anthropologist Paul Farmer has been quoted saying that poverty is the world's greatest killer. Farmer even considers the world's poor to be the chief victims of what he calls structural violence. Holmes defines structural violence as acts committed by configurations of social inequalities that have injurious effects on bodies similar to violence of a stabbing or a shooting. One example of how poverty can act negatively on bodies can be seen in the stressors that tend to co-occur with poverty, including housing and food instability, depression, and drug use. Kelly Knight found that these social determinants were often related to the patterns of consumption in women living in affordable housing structures in San Francisco, California. Knight found that the drug use of women living in these affordable housing structures was often the result of the low-income environment in which they live that breeds both danger and stress. One woman told of how this might be so, explaining that speed helped her calm down, but crack kept her angry enough to manage the life of a daily rent hotel she was living in. Poverty forced her to live in an environment in which she needed opiates to simply get through the day. This is incredibly telling of the nature of the relationship between poverty and drug abuse. The relationship between poverty and drug addiction is not just seen in narcotics, though. Alcoholism, too, shows a striking correlation to poverty. Research suggests that alcohol abuse is growing rapidly in low and middle income countries, despite the availability of screening instruments approved for use there. Other literature has found that the national recessions in personal income and employment are consistently followed by increases in cirrhosis mortality rates. The author argues that economic disruptions create conditions of social stress that lead to alcohol abuse. Think back to Juan. His respite drinking turned lethal when he lost his job and was unable to find work in the United States. Juan is just one of many, though. Countless individuals suffer from both poverty and addiction across the world. To tease them out and attempt to separate the two would be misguided. Biological predispositions, too, must be taken into account to understand the epidemic of addiction. It is in understanding the relationship between these three things that individuals like Juan can tell us about systems of inequity working on health outcomes across the world.